Steve is too kind. Not for the first time in my life, I feel like a complete imposter. If I'd entertained the thought when I started writing the first oil shot that I would end up in Houston, the oil capital of the universe, of course, talking about oil, I would have, I think, I don't know, I'd have taken a couple of aspirin or something. And some of you may be justifiably wondering what my expertise really is, even despite those kind words, to talk about this, this subject. I'll just make one further claim in my defense. I can, I think, claim to have a more intimate knowledge than anybody here with an absolutely crucial bit of oil infrastructure in your neck of the woods, and that is the Houston Ship Channel. And that is because I've surfed it. Can we see that? Next slide, please. That bald chap is not actually me, thank goodness. He is an off-duty lieutenant from the local, the Galveston Sheriff's Department on his day off. But what he is doing in the way out in the Galveston Bay is surfing a wave created by that ship. The sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed. In fact, it's not a tanker, but I'd say just don't be too pedantic about that. The big waves that they get out there, of course, there are no natural waves because of the sandbar of Galveston. So there's no natural waves there, not surfable anyway. The only waves that you get are the waves created by largely tankers traveling at speed through the deep channel and with the displaced seawater hitting the shallows. There is a serious point to this. I was down there. This doesn't sound like terribly serious research, I'm sure, for a serious book on peak oil, but I assure you it was quite essential. I was after this image because it basically says something to me about the enormous free ride that oil gives all of us in our lives, gives society as a whole. Just compare this ride with what the surfer normally experiences at the beach. At the beach, a natural wave, your average surfer would be really happy with a ride lasting about 200 feet and perhaps lasting 10 seconds, 15 seconds, something like that. That would be a good day. These guys surfing oil-generated tanker waves via the displaced seawater, their record is 4.5 nautical miles in a little over 22 minutes. And I think that's not a bad. I think that's not a bad image to just to conjure up in our minds, the enormous free ride that we get from oil, by analogy, every day of the week. So I thought I'd just share that with you. But to come back to what Steve was saying about ASPO, I really do think there's been a bit of a sea change in Europe, and what I want to do tonight is really just review a few things about what's been going on in Europe in terms of the media coverage, what individual European oil men have been saying, and the rather shifting, and some may say shifty responses of European governments to this whole issue. And I do think, really, this is a serious point that when history is written, 2007 will go down as the year that peak oil went mainstream, at least in Britain, and at least on the evidence of the media coverage that we've had this year. So let's just. I'd just like to show you a few examples of what has appeared in the mainstream press this summer. I should say that when I started doing my research, January 2005 for the book, that you just could not find references to peak oil in the mainstream media. But now, particularly at the end of this summer, they are really quite commonplace, and that's why I say I think it's gone mainstream this year. Just a few examples. Can we go ahead, please? There we are. A nice lurid title from the Daily Mail. For those of you not familiar with the newspaper scene in Britain, the Daily Mail is a fairly lowbrow and I would say right-wing newspaper, but nevertheless it devoted a two-page spread in May to Oil-mageddon, as it called it. Lurid title, quite a few basic errors in the reporting, which was a shame because I spoon-fed the journalist quite a bit on this one. Nevertheless, they devoted two entire pages to it, and that I thought was striking, and it's also striking given the kind of newspaper that it is. Here's another one, A World Without Oil. Now this was striking because it was a front-page splash on the Independent newspaper. That was significant. I mean, it's a left-of-center campaigning newspaper, which tends to have fairly dramatic front-page splashes. Some might tell you that any old rubbish gets on the front page of the Independent, but I think that would be unkind. Here the story in fact, you might quibble with the headline, but the story that backed it up was really rock solid. It was very good journalism, and that was when June this year. This one I think is very interesting because it's the Times, no less, and is written by William Rees-Mogg. He's in fact Lord William Rees-Mogg. He's a peer of the realm, part of the aristocracy. So, and the Times, of course, is the newspaper of record, London Times. And here he is writing an op-ed just this summer. Are these the last days of the oil age? So, in British media terms, I think you might even say peak oil hasn't just gone mainstream; it's gone establishment. Because this is really pretty establishment. And I'm feeling a bit old hat, really. I mean, when you start off doing a project, and as I say, back in 2005, nobody was really talking about this. As an investigative journalist, that's great, because you've got something to yourself and you think you're doing something worthwhile. But as I say, everyone's doing it these days. Doing myself out of a job. Here's another one. This is one of mine from June. And this is a subject, it's to do with Iraq, and I think this is a subject where I think you could draw a very clear distinction between, if you want to call it consensus in Europe, or at least in Britain, and what my perception is the predominant view over here. I'll come back to the piece in a second, but I argue in the book and here as well that Iraq was not just all about oil, but all about peak oil. I'll come back to that in a second. But I'm struck. I've heard Kenneth DeFace, obviously the author of two very fine books on peak oil and obviously an American. I've heard him remark that he's absolutely amazed that all you Europeans seem to think that somehow Iraq was all about oil, whereas I think we Europeans would be equally astonished that anybody could come to any other conclusion. And I go a little further than that. I don't think it was just all about oil. I really think, and I argue at some length in the book, that it was all about peak oil. And I think that view too is gaining ground in Britain. By complete coincidence, the day after this piece was published, came this interview with Fatih Birol in Le Monde. And you probably know the quote. This was flashed around the world quite a bit, but I'll just read it out. If by 2015 Iraqi production does not increase exponentially, we have a very big problem, even if Saudi Arabia fulfills its promises. The figures are very simple. No need to be an expert. The gap between supply and demand will widen significantly. I think it's interesting that Fatih Birol should say that, and I may say the other thing that I've noticed whilst doing my research is that the IEA really has shifted position dramatically in the last 2 years. I'm not going to say too much about that because Argy's going to talk, I think, in some detail about the IEA. But the other critical thing about this, I think, is that this view of Fatih Birol's is not a new thought. After all, the geology hasn't changed very much in the last 5 years. So as I say, I spend some time in the book arguing that Cheney, Bush, and Blair were perfectly well aware of all this, of the unique importance of Iraq, and the reason that Iraq is uniquely important whilst deciding whether or not to go to war. Now, there's one final, I think, clinching bit of evidence for my thesis that peak oil has gone mainstream in Britain at least, and it's actually not in the newspapers, but on the radio. There was this summer a 2-hour drama on Radio 4, BBC's serious speech station. It was called A Second to Midnight, and it was entirely devoted to peak oil. It was set in the Niger Delta, and it concerned a senior oil geologist who may or may not have been based on Colin Campbell, struggling with his conscience, trying to decide whether or not to warn the world about peak oil or whether to keep his mouth shut and his pension safe. It was an excellent play. The science was good, and I think it's probably anybody else who knows the British media scene would tell you if an idea has arrived on Radio 4, then you really know you have made it. So that really is the evidence for peak oil going mainstream in the media. It's not consensus. I mean, it's not like it's not that everybody believes it, but I just think that we have reached, to use that sort of that overused phrase, we've reached something of a tipping point. Those of us who worry about peak oil and write about it are no longer, how shall I say, presumed to write about it in green ink. So I want to talk very briefly about the date of peak oil, not because I have any right to do so. As I say, I'm a non-technical observer of this debate. But I do think, and I think this approach might be interesting, that it is possible for outsiders. Now, the debate has moved on far enough, and it's possible for outsiders, non-technical people like myself, to draw some reasonable conclusions, not necessarily about a specific year, but to draw some limits, the outside of the envelope, the limit of what can reasonably be expected from oil production growth. And I'm going to move through this at reasonable speed. The argument, the evidence for my argument comes from a rather surprising source. I'm going to argue that the United States Geological Survey's 2000 World Petroleum Assessment, in fact, makes a very good case for an early oil production peak, contrary to its reputation. We all know about this document. I'm sure you know it probably better than I do. And with its forecast that ultimate will amount to some 3.3 trillion barrels. What's interesting to me is the status of this document. It's, it is routinely produced, is it not, as a trump card in this debate by what you might call the cornucopian end of the debate. This is flourished and slapped onto the desk. There's lots more oil than you peak oil peakists believe, therefore don't worry your little head. Well, let's just have a look at that, because let's see the next slide here. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The original study, of course, as I'm sure you well know, predicted a discovery by 2025 of some 650 billion barrels. Chop that up 30 ways, in the 30 years of the forecast period, which ran from 1995 to 2025, and you get 22 billion barrels a year. Reserve growth, they thought that reserves growth would produce almost as much again, 612 billion, chop that up 30 ways, 30 increments of 20 billion barrels per year. NGLs, I think they thought that NGLs would add some 250 billion barrels in both in reserve growth and discovery combined. All of that added up to an ultimate of 3,300 gigabarrels. But the really interesting thing about this is it's not how clearly reality has turned out since that forecast was made in one very important particular. And the USGS, to their credit, has done a self-assessment. In 2005, I think it was, they published an article assessing how well or badly their forecasts had got on. And that was done with the actual data leading up until 2003. What they found, of course, was that, as we all know, discovery is running at very much lower than they forecast, that only 9 billion barrels a year had been discovered, not 22. That's obviously, it's a massive shortfall, 60%. They were proud to report, though, that, of course, the reserve growth forecast was on track, so they said. But for me, what's interesting about this is that their acknowledgement of the 9 rather than the 22, and that deficit, that huge deficit, the fact that only 40% of that which they thought was available to be discovered has indeed been discovered, clearly puts the 3,300 number in some doubt. Now they say, of course, in their self-assessment, in the second document, they said that they tried to explain the shortfall in discovery as perhaps related to the relatively low price of oil at that point, and suggested that if prices rose and an exploration effort increased, then perhaps the real world might see the error of its ways and start giving up 22 billion barrels a year, perhaps, and not the 9. I don't see any evidence for this, and I'm sure most people in this room don't see much evidence for that. Oil discovery peaked in the 60s, as we know, when oil cost $2 a barrel, and it's down to 9. It's fallen consistently down to 9 billion barrels a year now, whilst the oil price has clearly gone northward. And I don't know, I haven't checked within the last half hour. It's probably north of $90 a barrel, I should think. So that doesn't seem to me to be a very sensible thing to say. Seems much more likely to me that discovery is going to keep on falling. And But I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to say that, that for the first time ever, oil discovery is going to plateau for the next 2 decades at 9 billion barrels a year. Now, that's obviously a fairly heroic assumption. It's never happened before, but let's just do that. Even if you do that, the amount of oil discovered will not be almost 650 billion, but just 260. If you then say, okay, the reserve growth forecast appears to be on track, let's just, for the sake of argument, accept that. So we're going to take the reserve growth as is. The NGL number is the one thing that I've had to finagle. They didn't reassess the NGL number in their reassessment. So what I've done is just deflate that by the same amount as the oil and gas discovery numbers have been underperforming. So kept all that in line. That gives you 100 there. And the net result of all that is that the ultimate figure, if you want to call it that, is not 3,300 but 2,830. So simply making that one assumption about future discovery knocks off almost 500 billion barrels off their ultimate. And the result of that, if you assume only 2 other things, global oil production peaking at the midpoint and demand growth growing as the IEA predicts between now and the peak. United States Geological Survey's, if you like, reduced ultimate produces a peak in 2017. So that's my take on it. So when I think, you know, there's been a degree of misunderstanding about the USGS numbers. I think actually they're rather good for the peak oil argument. Most peakists, well, a lot of peak oil forecasters attack the study, but actually I think it's their best friend in some funny way. Now, I'm encouraged in this analysis by the fact that the USGS itself has just recently revised downwards it's one of its most controversial regional resource assessments for East Greenland. You may remember that when they first published the study, that the idea that East Greenland had 47 billion barrels, or could have, was greeted in some quarters by a degree of hilarity. Well, now they've cut that number from 47 billion to 9 billion. So they are coming my way, if I can put it that way. So too are a number of senior oilmen in Europe to get back on track. The view of peak oil from Europe, that was my view of peak oil from Europe, if you like. That's how I justify that in this talk. Number of senior oilmen in Europe, I think, are also becoming much more loquacious about peak oil, and that was very much in evidence at Cork. There were a number of senior oilmen. It was striking. There were a number of senior oilmen queuing up, really, to argue the case for a relatively early peak. I won't cite them all, but the most senior of all was, of course, Lord Oxborough, former chairman of Shell. I interviewed him just before the conference, and he said basically that, well, as quoted there, he said that production could peak and plateau within the next 20 years, $150 oil quite likely, and the other remark that he made was that that he thought that many in the oil industry had their heads almost in the sand over oil depletion, which I think is altogether fairly strong stuff for the former chairman of Shell. Although I would say, I would observe that I think it's probably rather easier for superannuated, retired oil men to speak more openly about this subject, of course, than those who are still employed in the industry and whose mouths are perhaps stuffed with executive share options. Even more striking then that in fact in 2006 Thierry Desmarais, the chief executive of chairman, excuse me, of Total, had, as it were, come out as a peakist. He said in 2006 in a speech in Paris that that peak would come in 2020, and for me the most striking thing he said was, please governments find ways to depress demand growth, which I thought was a stunning thing for such a senior oil man to say. I mean, just think about it for a second. Here's a man who's both his personal and corporate interests depend on him selling ever greater quantities of oil, and yet he was making remarks of that sort. I think it was a mark of how serious our situation is, and also I think it puts pay to that absurd notion that is put around by some environmentalists and some conspiracy nuts that somehow peak oil is oil industry propaganda. And of course what he's also done, Thierry Desmarais, is he's laid down a challenge to government, and a tough one. I call it the Desmarais peak oil challenge. That sounds like a slightly dodgy diet. Well, in a way that might not be a bad analogy at the end of the day. But I just want to spend the last bit of the talk trying to just run down how it is that various European governments have responded to the Desmarais peak oil challenge. Let's start with Desmarais' own government. France has taken obviously just the very first tiny step of addressing peak oil by getting its relevant government department to at least do a study of when global oil production will peak, 2013 or 2023 on various different assumptions. So too has Germany. BGR, as we know, forecast 2017. Having said that, there's been no noticeable impact on French or German energy policy, but I'm encouraged that they have taken at least that step, in contrast to the next suspect, British government, whose position is that there will be no peak until after 2030, provided the necessary investments are made. That's from a letter from Malcolm Wicks, who is our energy minister, a letter published last year. Now, it's a bit difficult for me to understand how it is that the British government can be so sure, because they have never done a study, and that exposes them to some difficulty, and I want to just take you through that for a second. They've done no study, and so as a result of that, their assertion that no peak before 2030 relies on the International Energy Agency's long-term forecast. Now, it is true that the World Energy Outlook, the big thick red book that they publish every year, the annual forecast, the last one in 2006, continues to show oil production growth to 2030. But there's a real problem with this. In fact, there's several. First problem is that the IEA long-term model that produces that forecast depends on the USGS WPA 2000 study. Now, this is interesting. The analyst who actually is responsible for the IEA's long-term model, I interviewed him for the book, and actually he accepts quite openly that there is potentially a problem with this. I'm just going to quote him. He said, talking of the use of USGS inputs, if you want, this can be the weakness of the model. It's not our analysis. We took the data from outside and we assumed they are correct. Now, you see the way I've stacked it up there. It seems to me that the British government's position is based on sand, basically. And of course, there's another problem, which is rather more immediate, which is that the IEA has just recently changed its tune rather dramatically. Again, I'm not going to say too much about this, but we all know that they have predicted a supply crunch, so-called, by 2012. They, of course, wouldn't call it peak oil. They say it's all to do with above-ground factors, as we know. But I think those of us living through it might be forgiven for not appreciating the distinction. It seems to me that the IEA, what it's beginning to describe, is beginning to look, I think, to walk, and talk a bit like a duck. Perhaps that should be a peking duck. Excuse me. Thank you. Someone's awake over there. Very good. In any event, I think the crutch that supports the crutches that have supported the British government's sanguine position are really in splinters. Yet, only this month, can we have the next slide, please? That's it. Only this month, on the Prime Minister's website, this appeared: the world's oil and gas resources are sufficient to sustain economic growth for the foreseeable future. Now, I think this is great. This is what Hubbard would have described as a beautiful case of prediction by ambiguous statement. What on earth is the foreseeable future? Apparently, for the British government, it doesn't even last 5 years, because they've had, in order to make this statement, they've had to ignore the medium-term IEA forecast. And in fact, on this website, they kind of back this up with a quotation from another document from the IEA, which is not one of its key forecasts, and it's 2 years out of date. So, all in all, I think the British government's position is in tatters. But just to come back to this Iraq point for a minute, why should I be surprised? If I argue, you may or may not agree with this, but if I argue that basically that Iraq was all about peak oil, and that was what motivated, at least in part, the British government, it follows, doesn't it, that the British government's official position is not its real position. That follows. I'm encouraged, I'm encouraged in this thought by the fact that two really quite senior British officials who were significant advisors to Tony Blair have a very different view of peak oil than does the government, at least the government's official position. These are the officials I'm talking about. Sir David Manning, who is our ambassador to Washington, made a great speech at Stanford in 2006. He said, and he seemed to come down, his position seemed to endorse the position that peak would come between 2010 and 2020, excuse me. And of course, he was Tony Blair's key foreign policy advisor in the run-up to Iraq. Sir David King is Britain's chief scientific advisor, also influential with Tony Blair. He's known to have had Tony Blair's ear on really important subjects like climate change and nuclear power and that sort of thing. I asked him in 2005, he said 10 years or less, although I think his position has shifted a bit more recently. So how are you going to explain these split positions? I think the answer is relatively simple. I should say I get a bit frustrated about people's fixation. Having talked a little bit before about the date, I get frustrated when people get overly fixated with the date of peak oil. I don't think it really matters that much. We're close enough for us to be in serious trouble over peak oil, whatever date it happens. If it's 2020, it's too soon. But I would say just about this, there is a distinction between the dates being talked about here and the not until after 2030 position of the British government. And it's a key one. And I think it's that one of those dates, or if you're going to say within 10 years, that's clearly within the planning horizon. After 2030 isn't necessarily. So the difference is whether you as a government do anything about it, or whether you just shuffle it off into the next person's term of office. Obviously a high-risk strategy for the rest of us. So I think James Schlesinger actually put his finger on it in Cork. He remarked that basically that the politicians' first duty was to get elected, second duty to get re-elected, and that to achieve these purposes, Cassandra was not a good role model. So I think that's really, that's what's behind it. And to wrap up really, I think it's all the more extraordinary then that any politician in government anywhere in the world would openly espouse peak oil and openly espouse some of the radical measures that I think are necessary to try and tackle it. But that is apparently what has happened in Ireland. We also heard from Eamon Ryan, excuse me, Ireland's energy minister. He's the Green Party MP, energy minister, part of the coalition, the new coalition government in Ireland. He spoke in Cork, and I was very impressed by the program that he outlined. Stiff emissions and renewables targets, lots of investment in rail and bus networks, but critically, Ireland is now beginning to talk about rationing oil. They are actively discussing introducing an oil rationing plan. It's early days yet, but what they're actually talking about is some kind of personal carbon trading scheme in which everybody gets a tradable ration, fuel ration, and you live within it, you can sell. If you don't live within it, if you exceed it, then you're going to have to go and buy some more. But that the total amount of rations comes down every year. Pretty radical stuff. And I think I agree with Ryan. I think this is an absolutely critical part. It's an absolutely essential response to peak oil. It seems to me that this is the common sense. He calls it common sense, and I think that's right. It's the common sense way to achieve an orderly reduction in fossil fuel consumption, and I stress the word orderly. I think here, again, there'd be a key distinction, I think, between Europe and America. I think this is possibly a policy which plays better to European social democratic traditions than perhaps American libertarian sensibilities. So perhaps it would offend Europeans marginally less than Americans, but I wouldn't push that too far. I do think that Schlesinger's law probably applies equally well in Ireland as it does anywhere else, and it's important to realise that Ryan is part of the Greens are the minority partners in a coalition government, so the chances of Eamon Ryan and his Green colleagues getting this past their colleagues in government, let alone the electorate, I think are slim. But I do wish them good luck because I think it's one of the few signs of grown-up, joined-up engagement with peak oil in national governments today. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks very much. 45.